Hello everyone, my name is Chris Lawson and I'm the head of CLU's fertilizer team. In this webcast today we'll be providing an update on the coronavirus, now known as COVID-19, and its impact on the fertilizer markets. Before we get started, I would like to recognise those in China and around the world that have been impacted by this terrible situation. We expect all those that are affected a speedy recovery and a return to everyday life. This is an update on the situation as of the 20th of February, and it's obviously important to consider this is a very dynamic situation that's changing on a daily basis. Here at CLU, we're striving to update our customers on the situation and provide some clarity on what is an incredibly important event. So please don't hesitate to get in touch should you have any further questions or would like further updates. So speaking with me today are my colleagues in China, Gavin Zhu, who's based in Beijing and covers nitrogen and potash markets for us, and Isabel Chen, who's based in Shanghai, who covers phosphate and sulfur markets for us. I would like to give a special mention to both Gavin and Isabel. Like many in China, they have been working from home, dealing with multiple connection issues and lots of isolation, obviously. So we really appreciate the efforts of both Gavin and Isabel in getting an update on what's happening in the market and, as I say, what is an incredibly important situation. Our team in China, and both here in London and around the world, have been speaking with producers, traders and distributors in the Chinese market to get an idea of what is going on. There is a lot of noise around the issue, with lots of sensationalist claims coming from all corners of the market and the globe. So it's super important for us to be considering what fundamentals are at play here and reassessing the situation on a daily basis. Here's what we're going to be running through today. What we're doing is just attempting to provide a high-level update of what's going on across different fertilizer markets and the supply chains. Again, if you would like any further detail on what we touched on today, please do not hesitate to get in touch. So it's obviously important to get started with what's going on with the actual COVID-19 update now. So I think it's an important kind of landmark moment as well, given the most recent updates. We do have a decline in the confirmed cases in Wuhan, which is the epicenter of the environment. This is the first day we've actually seen that, and we are seeing continued declines in the confirmed cases in China outside of Hubei, but also Hubei province outside of Wuhan. The bottom left chart here really shows, I think it's quite powerful, it really shows just how much people movement within China has been impacted. We usually see a sharp uptick in Chinese railway passenger flow after the New Year holiday period. That did not come through at all this year. And I think it's a really powerful way of showing just how much this COVID-19 has impacted people movement and product movement, commodity movement across all of China. Where the real impacts have been on commodity markets have been around the logistical constraints, and that's particularly the case for products that move by truck. So that's both for raw materials, so fertilizer production and commodity production, but also finished product. And of course, there's also been a shortage of labour with extended New Year holidays, and people more cautious about going back to work, and that's obviously causing lots of disruptions across the whole supply chain. And then of course there's the little things that we don't put much thought into that also just have a huge impact, like the shortage of necessary materials such as face masks, and even certificates that are required for export and things like that. There is just a really big impact across all things within the production of commodities and fertilizers. In terms of an update on what the government are doing to address the situation, there have been some very significant developments throughout the course of this week so far. Obviously, with a shortage of transport and a shortage of labour, truck freight rates have been increasing. To offset this, the government announced earlier this week that they will be removing all tolls on highways and that's likely to be effective on the 30th of June. So that's something that the government's actively doing to try and bring down the cost of transport within China. We're also reaching an incredibly important part of the year for fertilizer demand and agricultural production within China with the upcoming spring planting season. And the government are really doing what they can to prioritise the movement of fertilizers and the raw materials that are required to produce said fertilizers. So in terms of logistics, some of the things that the government are doing is they're providing somewhat of a green channel to allow the free movement of fertilizers and to provide some solutions around the raw materials as well. Also encouraging farmers to double crop crops like rice, just to make sure that they've got enough agricultural production taking place as well. And obviously that is the core to any society. In eastern China, we do see an improvement in the labour situation, and governments there are taking attractive measures to encourage workers back into their work. There are some issues that we've noted in provinces in southern China where labour shortage is a big problem, particularly in ports, and that's important to consider, particularly for the phosphates market, where lots of the phosphate fertilizers are exported from ports like Fancheng. So while the situation is seemingly improving, there are of course these bottlenecks that are built up that will need to be alleviated across the whole supply chain. This is incredibly important due to that aforementioned spring application season, which is fast approaching and in some provinces has already begun. These bottlenecks will undoubtedly cause a tightening of the domestic fertilizer market in China, and that may flow through to the international market. And we've certainly noted a skewness in the supply chain. We see large inventories at port level and also at some producer levels, but there's less product where it actually needs to be to get applied and onto the crops. So this will ultimately likely cause some short-term domestic pricing volatility, and we're going to touch on that towards the end of the presentation. So we're going to start off with an overview of what's happening in the phosphate markets, because that is undoubtedly the one that is most exposed. I'd like to point out that China has 36% of global phosphoric acid capacity and 39% of DAP, MAP and TSP capacity on a combined basis. We shouldn't also forget that China is the largest exporter of finished phosphates globally, and they're also the largest exporter when it comes to animal feed phosphates and also industrial phosphate products. So the effect of what's going on in the phosphate market is wide-ranging. It's not just going to hit fertilizer markets. And you can see on the map in this slide, Hubei province alone is responsible for 32% of all of that phosphoric acid capacity within China. So it really goes to demonstrate that this is potentially a big issue. So I'm going to hand over to the expert now, Isabel, and she's going to provide some updates on what's happening in Hubei province and around China. Over to you, Isabel.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So this slide shows a detailed operating status in Hubei. At the center of the outbreak, operating there is more impacted. According to CRU research, as at February the 19th, among the total 14.7 million tons capacity, up to 56% of them are now idled, including several large plants, namely Hubei Xiangyun, Dongsheng, and China Blue Tan Dayukou. And there are still around 44% of the capacity remain running. However, only a few plants are operating relatively stable, who locates right along the Yangtze River, thus able to get raw material supplies under the logistics restrictions. These include Yihua Group, Xinfa Group, and Hubei Sanling. The others, however, are mostly consuming previous stocks and running at lower rates. Out of Hubei, operations have been more or less influenced as well. Sichuan Longmeng brings forward their maintenance plan to February, which will last for 20 to 30 days. Longmeng is a main MAP producer in China, while Wenfu of Guizhou Phosphates Group is less influenced, but Kailin from the same group has lowered their operating rate due to feedstock issue, but the problem is expected to be resolved in recent days. So the COVID-19 has caused an overall decline in phosphate's operating rate in near term, but the condition is expected to recover gradually, especially out of Hubei province, as regional restrictions are started to be removed and industries are encouraged to restart over the next few weeks. Next slide, please, and over to you now, Gavin.
Thanks, Isabel. Unlike phosphate industry, Hubei takes small capacity share in China. It accounts for 5% of total ammonia capacity and 3% of total urea capacity. The coronavirus leads to a low operating rate for the Chinese urea producers. The daily production reduced by 10 to 15% in the first half of February, but it has improved from mid-February. In terms of impacts on demand, purchases for agriculture demand delayed, which is also improving gradually. However, the industrial demand is expected to slump in February and March because majority of resin plants are not expected to resume until March. Because of the logistics constraints and labor shortage, CRU expects Chinese urea Q1 exports will slump over 50% compared to the same period 2019. Next slide, please. From the left chart, we can see that Chinese port inventory of potassium chloride reached a record high by January 2020. Yesterday, 19th February, the Chinese government published documents to ensure fertilizer supply during the spring application season, including measures that Sinoagri and Sinofert have assessed to use the country's strategic potash reserve for the first time since the mechanism was formed in 2015. Now I'll pass it over to Isabel.
Thank you, Gavin. Sulfur port stocks in China have been ramping up since the second half of 2019 and jumped to a new high after the New Year holiday. Stocks in South China ports are mainly owned by phosphate producers, while many stocks at Yangtze River ports are owned by traders, so the spot market is more active there. Hubei is one of the largest sulfur consumers in China, and they mostly purchase its outside from East China coast refineries and river ports. Although there were some rises in phosphate prices recently, downstream demand overall remained quite weak, given the situation that most producers in Hubei are now idled or running at low rates. So this is putting more pressure on supply-demand fundamentals of sulfur market in China. The next slide, please, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you both, Gavin and Isabel, for those updates. So we just thought it would be important to give people an overview of what's actually happened with prices so far. So each of the charts here are indexed to the beginning of December, and we're looking at the nitrogen, phosphate and sulfur markets. We haven't looked at potash here because that is decided on an annual contract and that price is not so far changed. So you can see here that there really has been pretty limited price reaction since the coronavirus outbreak, which really took hold towards the end of January. And it's important to consider as well what's going to happen with prices and where we see things moving. So where there is probably most upside risk to prices is in the phosphate market, as mentioned at the start. We have started to see some modest price increases being factored in. You can see that in the yellow line in the middle chart there. We've had 2 consecutive weeks now of FOB DAP China prices moving up. And so we are starting to see some of that positive sentiment coming into prices. However, that's more reflective of international markets than the situation in China, we think. Now, there's going forward, there is some obvious price upside based on the sheer volume of capacity within China and the supply disruptions. However, we're not getting too carried away just yet with our price forecast. We do think, as I say, there is upside to prices. However, there is an improving situation with the logistics. As Isabel said, some of the producers in the southern provinces are operating okay, and they're a big chunk of the total capacity within China. And there's also plenty of availability from markets such as Saudi Arabia, which competes into lots of China's markets, which is ultimately going to cap some of that price upside that could come through from the effects of this market, from the effects of COVID-19. In nitrogen markets, we do think there is probably more downside risk to prices going forward over the next few months. If the expected rises in domestic demand for urea and also some expected domestic price increases, if that demand and price increase does not come into fruition, then that could lead to more availability for exports over the next few months. So that provides some obvious downside. Meanwhile, in the international ammonia market, there has been lots of downward sentiment there based on China's imports. China is an importer of ammonia, particularly for industrial markets, and those industrial markets are on the coastal areas. So that has obviously, those industrial markets have been damaged by the loss of labour and due to the COVID-19. That's ultimately prevailing into the weak sentiment. The longer those labour shortages and that lower industrial production is extended for, the longer that weak sentiment will prevail. Sulphur markets have been incredibly weak over the past 12 months. They've exceeded, gone below all expectations in the weakness in that market. So really what this situation is going to do is just going to make the market take longer to recover, particularly with those high stocks that we've just seen in the previous chart. It's likely a similar story with potash as well. Huge stocks and the opening of the strategic reserves, which Gavin mentioned. Any potential dent in demand, which the COVID-19 virus will cause, all of these factors will only prolong the much-watched negotiations for the annual contract between the consortium of Chinese potash buyers and international potash exporters. So there's a real mixed view of what's going to happen across the different fertilizer markets here. Of course, we're monitoring this situation on a daily basis. It's incredibly dynamic, and it's important that we're constantly kind of updating our forecasts and keeping an eye on what's happening across fertilizer supply and demand. We do hope this update has been helpful for you and provided some clarity into what is an incredibly dynamic situation. I thank Isabel and Gavin again for their input into this and their continued hard work, and thank you all for your for your time today. Again, please don't hesitate to get in touch should you have any further questions. Thank you.